had a couple of documentaries I want to talk about. The main one from last night is eating, and then we also had a couple of others that the advanced people watch with Dr. Tunsky and so on. And you should have questions and or observations. So everybody's assignment was to write down 3 questions. Okay? So go ahead and dig those out. That the information is so vital that I feel like it is life and death. And I can give you examples of where for lack of this information and lack of this understanding, people die every day. Now, maybe it's not your people, so you're not affected. Maybe it's not your mother who's dying of malnutrition. Maybe it's not your aunt or your uncle that's dying of malnutrition and a bad diet. Maybe it's not your neighbor that's dying of malnutrition and for lack of information about this. But in our tradition, in our 1,000-year tradition, one of the things that we were taught, and that I was taught by my teachers, was that the most important adjunct to the physical medicine is food, diet, and nutrition. It is absolutely the most important adjunct. And in fact, you can't say that you're practicing a traditional therapy if you're not addressing food, diet, and nutrition. You can't say that. If all you're doing, for example, all right, so let's say there are 5 major aspects of the practice of any indigenous and traditional medicine, okay? So we look at all of these different systems, and we look at not just what do they do, and why do they do it, but what have they done for so long? Okay, in other words, an area of emphasis, a specific teaching, a thing that practitioners who started when they were children in schools and are now in their 70s and 80s and 90s, as their last living bequest to their students and the next generation of their students, that if they could have a limited life ahead of them and were preparing themselves in some way to pass on to the next generation, what would they tell you is the most important things not to forget and not to stop doing? What would those things be? And it's really weird. Okay? It's weird because it doesn't matter if you're in China, it doesn't matter if you're in Indonesia, it doesn't matter if you're in Montana, it doesn't matter if you're in Thailand or Burma or Laos or Vietnam or the continent of India or even the continent of Africa. The simplest way that we say, and this is just one of these things, it's not all of them, but just one of these things, is you are what you eat. Not only are you what you eat, it's not possible for you to be anything else other than what you eat. You are what you don't eat. And that often gets left out of the question. You are what you don't eat. Dr. Benjamin Lust, who was the first president of the American Naturopathic Medical Association, who founded the association in the late 1800s as an American Western naturopathic society of medical doctors who practiced non-invasive natural medicine that they also believed was spiritual-based medicine, okay, because that's also one of those teachings, by the way. And he published the world-famous omnibus on naturopathy in 1918. World famous omnibus in naturopathy in 1918. All right, and he published this book. Tome might be a better terminology for it. Tome, okay, because it's freaking huge. Okay, 1,000 pages in 1918, hardback, right? As best as I can determine, there are 3 copies in the United States, and I have 1, remaining intact. The other 2 I've seen, The other two I've seen, and they're tattered in pieces, and they're tied together with either rubber bands or rope or string in cases. I have the only one that I've seen in the last 20 years that's actually in almost original condition, is completely intact, and no missing papers and no separated signatures, they're called, okay? Because it was hand bound and sewn together, right? So 90% of the information in this 1918 omnibus put together by the president of the American Naturopathic Association at that time, which at that time had 400 hospitals and about 4,000 doctors that belonged to the association. It was way larger of an association than the AMA. By 10 times more doctors belonged to the ANMA than the AMA at that time, 10 times. Okay, medical doctors, osteopaths. There were chiropractors in 1918 because that became a thing in 1911. Okay, so 7 years later, it's a wildfire of chiropractic, and osteopathy is doing great. And at that time, osteopathy is a holistic medical discipline. No drugs, no surgery. In fact, they were militant. No drugs, no surgery. The cut, burn, and poison traditions of Europe have been very well known for over 100 years or 150 years, and had pretty well been discounted as having any useful impact for public health at all. Pretty well discounted. That if you read papers, newspapers, between the years of 1880, for example, and 1918, when the omnibus was published, okay, if you found a reference to allopathic medicine, it was usually in reference to a prosecution for malpractice. The most common reference that you found for Western medical doctors was in newspapers was for murder, mayhem, malpractice, fraud, and other major crimes. Okay? So much so that in many countries in Europe, allopaths were banned. Allopathy as a medical practice was banned and was considered superstitious, and fundamentally, something fundamentally was wrong with it. And allopaths were kind of considered like, they were the used car salesmen of so-called medicine at the turn of the century. And in fact, they were everything that they call us today. Quacks. And selling medicine that could not possibly do what they said it would do. Not possible. And therefore, it didn't. The only reason that they did this is because they were uniformly followers of a new religion that came into being in the 1800s in a big way, called technocracy and the Cathedral of Science, and the religion of science. And Darwin was the first pope of the religion of science. And their philosophers of Nietzsche and Descartes, Gott ist Damerang. God is dead. But if God's dead, who is the new God? See, a lot of times people think science, which are atheists, that the presupposition is that you're a scientist and an atheist, that you don't have a God, or that you don't believe in a God, and you don't act like a religious person who believes in a God. And I want to tell you that this has been tracked and researched and written about for 150 years, and that is absolutely not true. There's a substitution game that takes place. And the substitution game is where pseudoscience, not pure science, but pseudoscience, which is based on a collection of a data set and then a well-rounded effort at conjecture, and then assuming that the flights of fancy that the conjecture leads one into are as much a fact as the data set. And scientifically, that's not true. We know the scientific methodology of observation, hypothesis, test, peer review test, proving, the process of scientific proof. We know all this. Most of the things that you've been taught in your life to believe are scientific do not follow that process. So if you look up in Wikipedia, you look up what is the scientific process, and you would assume that everyone who's a scientist or every scientific agency or every scientific community would follow all these steps to come to their conclusions, which they would then extrapolate into progress for humanity. And in fact, they declared in the 1800s that they were going to solve, that the scientists were going to cure all illnesses, cure all social dysfunctions, cure all issues of starvation and disease, cure all issues of population, issues with population density called cities, cure all issues relating to food production. They declared that all of these things would be solved by the turn of the century, by the new millennium, by the turn of the century, based on their projections and algorithms scientifically. Well, if you go back and you look at this stuff, you find out that all of the scientists' projections were completely wrong. Completely wrong. All the things that they said that they would do with the science, they weren't able to do any of them. And in fact, it turned out that when you took these various schools of science and the finest and the brightest and the smartest minds of the now growing atheistic, scientific communities, that in fact the end result of all of their science was incredible devastation and harm to virtually every man, woman, and child on the planet. So as of today, every man, woman, and child on the planet suffers some every day from the consequences of the social application of the religious principles of science, which, by the way, is not Scientology. Okay, so when I say science, and social and religious and all that, I'm not talking about Scientology. I'm not talking about any religion that you know of as you know it, because at least the Scientologists call what they do a religion, openly. And they tell you it's faith-based. You have to have faith. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't, whatever it does, okay? And I'm speaking in third party. I'm not a Scientologist. But I've studied it. And I've read the books. And I read the first book by L. Ron Hubbard when I was 11 years old.
You will grow to be tall, staring out over miles of land without it.